Part 1. Sour Mashing in American Whiskies. Moonshine Life Recipes Group. By J.B. Wagonmaker. An intro. Even if you're a veteran of making Scotch-type whiskies, where the grain bill is mostly if not entirely barley, there are a few quirks to the American whiskey styles that will likely cause you to stumble when you have a crack at them. Some of the key features of an American whiskey compared to your typical Scotch are: milder fermenting yeast strain, leading to less aggressive flavors. This is part of why Moonshine, unoaked American whiskey, can be drunk straight off the still, whereas a properly fermented Scotch tastes pretty noxious until after at least a bit of oak aging. Wider range of grain types used, where barley is usually just a small fraction. The others and the flavors they are generally known for are: rye, warm, spicy notes; corn, maize, sweetness and a distinctive smooth corn flavor; wheat, mild and sweet. To qualify for most of the famous American spirit types, e.g. bourbon, the spirit must be aged in charred virgin American oak vessels. Only the less known, less regarded varieties are allowed to use uncharred oak or used oak. Contrast this with Scotch, which is almost exclusively aged in used oak. In the earlier days of colonization, whiskies were normally drunk white unoaked rather than being aged on oak. George Washington's own distillery famously used a mash bill of 60% rye, 35% corn and 5% malted barley, twice distilled but not oaked. Nowadays unoaked whiskey is better known as Moonshine, but it's amazing how smooth and tasty it can be when made properly with the right yeast and a decent amount of corn in the mash. The key types of American whiskey and the grains behind them are: bourbon, minimum 51% corn, balance being rye, wheat and or barley. Rye whiskey, minimum 51% rye. Malt whiskey, minimum 51% malted barley. Wheat whiskey, minimum 51% wheat. Corn whiskey, minimum 80% corn. The balance of grains makes up a lot of the difference within each category. For example, a high rye bourbon having higher than the normal ratio of rye but still at least 51% corn, will have a much spicier, stronger flavor than a wheat bourbon, where all of the rye has been replaced with wheat. Enough of the background information and on to some helpful tips. First off in our guide is how to tackle the high rates of huskless, and often unmalted, grains that show up in most American whiskies. After that, we explain why you need to cook unmalted grains and how this can be achieved. Then, sour mashing. Just what exactly is it and why do distillers seem to be so proud of it? Mashing huskless, non-barley grains. One of the most notable differences between Scotch and American whiskey styles is the range and proportion of different grains. Whereas a Scotch would normally be all barley, most American whiskies have only a low rate of barley. The other grains are most commonly corn, maize, rye and wheat. These other grains are huskless and often unmalted, both of which present their own challenges. Enzymes for bourbon and other American whiskies. Enzymes are the key to a mash that successfully converts starch to fermentable sugar, but may be something you don't think much about when making a typical Scotch-type whiskey. When using just barley distilling malt, you'll always have a huge surplus of diastatic enzymes unless you're putting in a really high rate of unmalted barley, which is more trouble than it's worth, or specialty grains, which would just be weird. When making almost any American-style whiskey, you really need to think about the enzymes because there's a lot of unmalted grain and or malts with low diastatic power (DP). To pile straight into some jargon, a mash should aim for an average of at least 90 Windisch-Kolbach weak units. For reliable starch conversion, typical minimum diastatic power (DP) for different grains on their own is: Distillers malt barley 240 week. Munich malt barley 160 week. Rye malt 120 week. Wheat malt 240 week. Maize malt 15 week. All unmalted are specialty grains. 0 WK, no diastatic power. So distillers malt and wheat malt both supply a huge surplus of enzymes, enough for their own conversion and to also convert a fair amount of other grains as well. Rye malt can self-convert, meaning you could have a 100% rye mash if you wanted, and also convert a very small rate of other stuff. These numbers are all about potential, and are not a guarantee of performance. For example, if there's something wrong with your mash process, e.g. bad pH, inappropriate temperature, you'll have either killed off some enzymes or just reduced their performance, and you won't reach the theoretical conversion ability. On the other hand, extending your mash up to 3 hours while keeping the right conditions can wring some extra performance out. Then we've got the grains that cannot self-convert, which means they cannot be mashed on their own. They need to be accompanied by either a malt with surplus DP, or a supplementary source of enzymes like alpha amylase. Then we've got the grains that cannot self-convert, which means they cannot be mashed on their own. They need to be accompanied by either a malt with surplus DP, or a supplementary source of enzymes like alpha amylase. These ones include any unmalted grain, but also maize malt since it has nowhere near enough enzymes to self-convert. A point to note with most of these is that they also require a cooking step to gelatinise their starch, make it soluble. Maize malt does have moderate solubility at mash temperatures, but a lot of it will remain locked away without a cook step. Specialty grains are a bit different. They need an external source of enzymes, e.g. base malt, to convert in the mash, but most, e.g. crystal and chocolate malts, don't require a cook step. This information is mainly for those looking to build their own recipes, as all of our kits are set up with an appropriate base enzyme source. Our distillers yeast packs also contain a fair wallop of glucoamylase enzyme, which will convert any remaining unconverted starches in the fermenter as long as they are dissolved. This enzyme can also be purchased separately if you are recycling your yeast or using a yeast that does not come packaged with enzymes. Another very handy enzyme is glucanase, not to be confused with glucoamylase, which breaks down beta-glucans in the grain cell walls. Another very handy enzyme is glucanase, not to be confused with glucoamylase, which breaks down beta-glucans in the grain cell walls, typically providing a little boost to efficiency but also making the mash or wash more fluid. This is particularly handy with low barley grain bills like American whiskies where everything tends to turn to gloop. It can be used in the mash but is especially important for breaking down grainy remnants in a ferment on grain wash, see next section, and is included with most of our American whiskey recipe packs. Finally, a note on barley addition rates on American whiskey recipes you may find online. American distilling malt is typically made of 6-row barley, which has quite a bit higher DP than even our own 2-row distiller's malt. So you might see a lower barley fraction in these US recipes than what we put in our recipe packs, but we've rebalanced this for our lower strength barley or wheat. Lautering versus fermenting on grain. Anyone who has played around with beers or whiskeys with a lot of non-barley grains will know that you need to add a pile of oat or rice hulls to assist with drainage, otherwise a stuck mash is quite likely and a slow-draining mash with poor efficiency is inevitable. The fact that barley comes with its husk attached is both its beauty and its curse. It's that husk, on the barley or added separately, that lets the mash drain properly under gravity, rather than just sticking together as a big gob with serious water retention problems. That's why Scotch-type whiskies with all, or at least mostly, barley can be mashed and lautered, recirculated, drained and sparged normally. That's where you drain off the sugary liquid from the completed mash, wash off as much of the trapped sugar as you can with sparge water, and chuck the remaining spent grain away. Which is a good thing, because husks are a source of astringency that you don't want leaching into your wash during fermentation and distillation. So what about bourbons and other American whiskeys, where the barley content is usually less than 20%, or sometimes none at all? Do you just need to add lots and lots of extra oat hulls each time? If you want to mash and lauter like you would a Scotch, then yes. You need lots of oat hulls and efficiency is typically fairly low, similar to or less than an all barley mash. But here's where it gets beautiful. Those other grains don't have a husk to assist with drainage, right? But they also don't have a husk to impart astringency to a fermentation, so you don't need to chuck them away at the end of the mash. The whole mash, once completed, can go into the fermenter. This hillbilly-sounding approach has the following advantages. 1. Very high efficiency, no losses of residual sugar in the grain bed. 2. Yeast and enzymes will continue to work on any unconverted grain during fermentation. 3. No slow drainage or any drainage at all. 4. No need for sparging or the extra water it adds. 5. No fancy mashing vessel needed, can be done in an insulated pot or chili bin. 6. No oat hulls needed. 7. No limit on mash-out temperature. In fact, the entire mash can be boiled, optional, before cooling and fermentation to maximize extraction. This also gives you a pre-fermentation, hot break, that may help to reduce initial foaming during distillation. 8. Potentially more grainy flavors coming through to the spirit. And of course a few disadvantages. 1. Larger fermentation needed for the same size wash to account for grain mass. 2. Straining needed post-fermentation to prevent residual grain material from entering the still. 3. Higher tendency for distillation, boil foam up, skim foam off the top while the wash is heating up if you have this problem. 4. Post-mash pre-fermentation cooling is very slow and difficult, as the grain mass is too thick to naturally convect. 5. Much harder to recover yeast for reuse. 6. Basically impossible to get useful gravity measurements to determine wash ABV. 7. Potentially more grainy flavors coming through to the spirit. Hey, it's not always a good thing. With proper use of glucanase enzyme and the glucoamylase enzyme found in our distilling yeast sachets, it's amazing just how much a thick, syrupy porridge can ferment and break down to a thin, boozy wash with a greatly reduced amount of residual grain material. That stuff needs to be strained out before it goes into the still boiler, otherwise you're in for a very large and foamy distillation. Something like a hop grain bag is perfect for this as long as you don't overload it. Even an old clean pillowcase will work, but isn't ideal as it'll soak up quite a bit of your boozy goodness and may tend to clog up. Feel free to do a small sparge wash down of the strained grains to extract a bit more of the wash liquid from them. When straining the post-fermentation wash on the way to the still boiler, expect to lose about a liter of wash per kilo of initial grain in the mash, varies by grain type. That just needs to be accounted for in the original fermentation size, i.e. 33-liter fermentation for a 25-liter final wash size on an 8 kg grain bill. It's important that this extra volume of water is added to the fermentation, otherwise the alcohol strength in the liquid part can be too strong and you may get sick yeasties. If you only have a 30-liter fermenter, that's probably okay, as our American whiskey yeast can work a bit beyond its listed ABV limit if it's given a tasty all-grain substrate. Adding cold water or ice as the top-up water also makes it easy to get the whole thing down to yeast pitching temperature. Our approaches, right, so we've argued the case for at least trying a ferment-on-grain fog wash with American whiskeys. Does that mean barley can't be used at all? Not necessarily. If you want to stick with a lautered mash, either as personal preference or because you've had trouble with the fog approach, barley is absolutely fine here because it's not going into the fermenter. We offer 3 slightly different recipes for our American whiskeys, although they won't all be available for all recipes. It's up to you to decide their merits and what sounds best to you. As a general rule, barley doesn't add too much in the way of flavor and is mainly used as a source of enzymes to convert unmalted grains. Our recipe variations and what they mean are: lazy fog. Lazy fog recipes do away with barley completely, so you don't have to worry about extra steps or barley husks getting into your fermentation. It would be fair to say that they are less historically genuine, since they didn't have access to our modern enzyme sources back in the day and actually needed barley for this purpose. In most cases we are talking about a few percent of barley being replaced with a few percent more of the flavoring grains, so it's doubtful that the flavor difference would be noticeable. Except where very high rates of rye malt or moderate rates of wheat malt are used, lazy fog recipes require additional enzyme sachets. That's really their only disadvantage.